Please be seated. The Assembly has resumed its sitting.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes, member of Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I crave your indulgence just for a matter of 60 seconds. I just want to take this opportunity, as many of the members of this House know, my foundation comes from Cayman Brac, and I want to say congratulations. I want to say congratulations to both ministers and the Deputy Premier for a great job and yourself, of organizing all the events. And I want to say thank you to Cayman Brac and all the members for the great service and attitude that they presented to us. But just for a matter of clarification, I think there was some suggestion of Christopher Columbus stopping in Stake Bay and Watering Place, but if my memory serves me well,
don't go to Christopher Columbus now. That's way back now.
He had stopped in Spot Bay, but I just saying thank you to everybody in Cayman Brac for the great hospitality that they offered us. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I don't normally get up to a fellow Cayman Bracer, but I'd like to clarify for the record. He said if memory serves me well, and I think his memory is probably less than 50 years, if that much, he did stop in Watering Place.
We're still on item 1, and does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? I think I'd called that already. If not, I'll call on the Honorable AG to wind up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, thanks to the honourable member from East End for his interventions. And he posed a number of questions when he debated the bill. Mr. Speaker, he questioned whether there are threats to investigators, why they needed these protective protective gears, not equipment. Protective gears or protective equipment. Mr. Speaker, two things. One is the government, as I mentioned, has a positive obligation to these officers when they're carrying out their duties. And so it is understandable that the government would want to be proactive in ensuring that these officers do not suffer any harm, rather than waiting until something actually happens before they are provided with these equipment. But, Mr. Speaker, I am advised also that there have been instances, for example, where the persons have been arrested who are the holder of firearm licensed firearm, and persons who have knuckle dusters, Mr. Speaker. These are some of the things that the officers are faced with. So that also informs the basis for allowing them to be able to carry these protective gears. Mr. Speaker, he also asked where are these officers recruited from. I'm told, Mr. Speaker, that they are recruited. I'm told, Mr. Speaker, that currently there's a senior investigator and 5 other investigators who have between 15 and 40 years experience from policing from the UK, including the Met and Scotland Yard, and Grand Cayman, as well as other countries. And I'm told, Mr. Speaker, that all the officers who are now working there at some stage were members of at different stages were members of the RCIPS, albeit that they are not necessarily all from the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, he also asked about deployment and use of force, deployment of firearms. I repeat again, sir, and I just got confirmation that it is not, firearms is not included as one of those weapons, if I might put it that way, that the police officer will, that his investigators will be allowed to carry. It is not in the contemplation of the list here. And he also asked whether all the officers are trained or just certain officers, whether they're trained across the board. And the response I got is that all officers are trained, and because, Mr. Speaker, they all do the same work, including operations. So all officers are trained across the board, not just some officers. In respect of his query about what is meant by other means of restraint, Mr. Speaker, the response to that is that it is understandable that the list of protective equipment and gears could not be exhaustive because they can't anticipate all the potential situation that the investigators will face. And so, in addition to the list you have here, there could be face masks or face shields, hard hats, gas masks, respirators, among others, a variety of other equipment that they might be required to carry from time to time. And I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that has to be right because it is difficult for us to stand here and anticipate all the potential hazards, if I might put it that way, that these investigators would face in carrying out their duties. So, Mr. Speaker, that explains why the language is cast that way. And I'm reminded, Mr. Speaker, that the language is not unique to the anti-corruption law. It is also to be found in section 25(4) of the National Conservation Law 2013. Arms include batons, handcuffs, and other means of restraints, protective vests, tasers, and pepper spray. That is also in the National Conservation Law. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope I've been able to answer the query of the honourable member, but I do thank him for his interventions and, of course, it's very helpful debate on the matter. And with those words, Mr. Speaker, I commend the bill to honourable members and do thank them for their support. Thank you.
The question is that a bill shortly entitled the Anti-Corruption Amendment Bill 2018 be given a second reading. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The Anti-Corruption Amendment Bill 2018 has been given a second reading.
The Cayman Islands Red Cross Bill 2018.
The Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill the long title of which is a bill for law to provide for the incorporation of the Cayman Islands branch of the British Red Cross Society as the Cayman Islands Red Cross, and to further and to protect, of the British Red Cross Society as the Cayman Islands Red Cross, and to further and to protect the activities of the Cayman Islands Red Cross, and to make provision for incidental and connected matters.
The bill has been duly moved. Does the mover wish to speak to the bill?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, the Cayman Islands Red Cross, and I'm advised that it was founded in 1961 by someone named S.L. Cook Bodden, is an overseas branch of the British Red Cross Society, as are all Red Cross organizations in the other British overseas territories. Mr. Speaker, the Cayman branch was so formally recognized by way of an establishment agreement in the year 2000. This initiative, Mr. Speaker, to provide it with some legislative underpinning, is consistent with the trend throughout some of the other British overseas territories. And this bill, Mr. Speaker, is patterned off a model legislation that has been promoted by the British Red Cross for the overseas territories. Mr. Speaker, I am advised that an establishment agreement and the Constitution are among the framework documents that currently support the existence of the Red Cross. In 1991, it was also incorporated as a then Section 9, now Section 80 company. And that is, Mr. Speaker, documented in Schedule 3, page 22 of the bill itself. So it is now a Section 80 company. Mr. Speaker, the Cayman Islands branch of the Red Cross is currently answerable to the British Red Cross, and they are therefore required, among other things, to submit audited financial statements as well as other reports to that organization. At the February 2018 Overseas Territories Attorneys General Conference in Bermuda, Mr. Speaker, we had the benefit of a presentation, meaning the Attorneys General from the various overseas territories. We had the benefit of a presentation from the British Red Cross in which they, among other things, implored each overseas territory to enact domestic legislation to underpin the operations and the existence of the Red Cross branch. Mr. Speaker, during that presentation, they also highlighted the incalculable benefits of having the Red Cross in each territory and the outstanding services and support provided in each areas, such as disaster management and recovery, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that such a partnership takes a great deal of pressure off the government and, by extension, the National Treasury. Mr. Speaker, in addition to its base in Grand Cayman, the Cayman Islands Red Cross also operates here in Cayman Brac. I must confirm, Mr. Speaker, that I had a chat with the District Commissioner yesterday during the ceremony at Government Admin Building, and he confirmed the existence of the Red Cross here, Mr. Speaker, but not only that, he was very effusive in his praise for the work of the Red Cross in Cayman Brac. Mr. Speaker, the Red Cross, I'm told, currently has approximately 200 volunteers, most of whom are always very active. The current management structure, Mr. Speaker, comprises of a board of 7 trustees elected by the membership and serving on a voluntary basis, with the executive director as an ex officio member. Trustees are permitted to serve for a maximum of 2 years. Trustees are permitted to serve for a maximum of 2 3-year terms, after which they are required to take a 1-year break if they wish to continue to serve. Mr. Speaker, in addition to being a charity, the Red Cross works as an auxiliary to the government and operates 4 programs in the Cayman Islands. These programs are: 1, disaster management, which include preparedness and response, as well as risk reduction; 2, first aid training and event coverage; 3, child protection and sexuality education, including HIV testing; and 4, the thrift shop community outreach. Mr. Speaker, the Red Cross, which is sometimes described as a private organization with a public public function, has also established working partnership with many Cayman Islands government ministries and departments, some of which, Mr. Speaker, include the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, the Cayman Crisis Center, the Family Resource Center, the Department of Children and Family Services, the HSA, and, Mr. Speaker, of course, the National Hazard Management. All, Mr. Speaker, in order to serve the community. The primary source of income for the Red Cross, Mr. Speaker, is the thrift shop. Mr. Speaker, the Cayman Islands Red Cross, I'm advised, has the oldest disaster shelter in the Cayman Islands. And I'm advised also that when the potentially catastrophic fire occurred at the Jackson Point terminal in July 2017, the Red Cross, Mr. Speaker, had its shelter open within half an hour after the alarm was sounded. Mr. Speaker, we are all aware that the Cayman Islands Red Cross also deploys volunteers for disaster recovery and management in other parts of the Caribbean. And we are aware, Mr. Speaker, of the most recent deployment following the devastating hurricanes in 2017 in other parts of the Caribbean, when they not only raise supplies here, Mr. Speaker, but they also send goods and persons down to other parts of the Caribbean. So according to Mr. Speaker, in summary, the Red Cross bill aims to provide for the legislative recognition of the Cayman Islands Red Cross as a branch of the British Red Cross. And in so doing, Clause 1 provides for the law to come into force immediately after the dissolution of the Cayman Islands Red Cross Association, which is currently incorporated under the company's law. Clause 2, Mr. Speaker, defines various expressions used in the legislation. For example, the Establishment Agreement, the Constitution, the Fundamental Principles, the Geneva Convention, Mr. Speaker, which is one of the foundation premise for the Red Cross, and which represent the core values of the International Red Cross movement. Mr. Speaker, Clause 3 speaks to the establishment of the Red Cross as a body corporate to be called the Cayman Islands Red Cross. Clause 4 sets out the objects and purposes of the Cayman Islands Red Cross, which include working for the improvement of health, the prevention of disease, and the prevention and alleviation of human suffering in the Cayman Islands and throughout the world. And Mr. Speaker, it mandates that in so doing, the Red Cross shall act in accordance with the fundamental principles, the Constitution, and the Establishment Agreement. Clause 5, Mr. Speaker, sets out the long list of powers of the Cayman Islands Red Cross, which, in furtherance of the promotion of its objectives, include raising, depositing, and investing funds, and giving security for loan if they need to do so, and of course the ability to acquire real property. And more broadly, Mr. Speaker, to act as an autonomous auxiliary to the public agencies of government and to cooperate with government in promoting international humanitarian law, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Clause 6 establishes the Constitution and the governance structure of the Cayman Islands Red Cross and makes provision for its amendment. And this, Mr. Speaker, is outlined in Schedule 2, or page 12 of the bill itself. Clause 8, Mr. Speaker, exempts the Red Cross officers, employees, and volunteers from liability when acting in relation to the affairs of the Cayman Islands Red Cross, except in cases involving fraud or dishonesty. Mr. Speaker, I am aware that this is a real concern for them as well. As the director mentioned to me, they are involved in every public event, and they often have to help with persons who faint or have other issues at events, and they physically get involved with these persons, and they're concerned sometimes about not having the immunity from suit when they get involved, even though it is part of their DNA that they are obliged to do so. So this means a lot to them as well. Clause 9, Mr. Speaker, provides, among other things, that the Red Cross shall be liable for its own debts and obligations. Clause 13 confirms, Mr. Speaker, that the Cayman Islands Red Cross is an overseas branch of the British Red Cross Society. Clause 14 exempts the Red Cross from paying custom duties and goods used by it in carrying out its objects and purposes. And Clause 15, Mr. Speaker, seeks to circumscribe the scope of the law by, among other things, making it clear that the law shall not affect the rights and powers of the Cayman Islands government. Mr. Speaker, in respect of the custom duties, as I mentioned earlier, what has been explained to me is that if there is a disaster, which often is the case, they put out an appeal for assistance, and goods, all sorts of things are sent to them for distribution, and it is all invariably held up sometimes at customs whilst they haggle over whether or not duty should be paid. And these things, although they are for use to alleviate hardship because of the disasters. I'm sorry. So, Mr. Speaker, the bill also has a number of schedules which sets out, among other things, the fundamental principles of the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. That is on page 11 of the bill. It also deals with, Mr. Speaker, the constitution of the Red Cross as an overseas branch of the British Red Cross Society, page 12. And there's a schedule, Mr. Speaker, third schedule, which speaks to the establishment agreement of the British Red Cross Society and the Cayman Islands Red Cross as an overseas branch of the British Red Cross Society. Mr. Speaker, I hope I've been able to clarify or explain the purpose of the bill. But I think, Mr. Speaker, it is, I need not repeat. I tried to explain the excellent work of the Red Cross throughout these islands. It is self-evident, and it is true, Mr. Speaker, that in doing what they do, all on a voluntary basis, they have succeeded in taking off the strain of the national coffers in the provision of a lot of the services that they do provide to the society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is that a bill shortly entitled the Cayman Islands Red Cross Bill. I was so very pleased. Does any other member wish to speak? The member from Northside, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we just want to lend our support to this bill if the Attorney General can give us a couple of assurances. First of all, I don't have any reason to object to the Red Cross having a law, but I don't have any particular reason to support a law for the Red Cross at this point in time. Our concern is why can't they, whether they want to do it under companies under Section 80 companies law, or simply have a company that falls under the non-profit organization law. And we want to have some assurance that this law is not going to separate them in any way from the Red Cross, the UK Red Cross, where they would continue to have access for international matters, because we fully recognize the good work that the Red Cross does, and we wouldn't want anything to be able to be said in the future that because it is now an entity on itself and not continue to be a branch of the British Red Cross, that they will still be able to continue to do the very valuable work for which we are extremely grateful. But if the Honorable Attorney General can explain those kinds of reasons, we have no problem in supporting the bill.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Bud Down West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to rise to also give my support to this bill to some extent. I believe that the work that the Red Cross does here and across the world is invaluable. The only thing I just want to put on record, Mr. Speaker, and the Honorable Attorney General touched on it briefly in his remarks, is Section 8. And for ease of members of the Honorable House, I just read it. It says Section 8, 1, 2, and 3, where it says, officers of the Cayman Islands Red Cross acting in relation to any of the affairs of the Cayman Islands Red Cross shall be exempt from any liability attaching to them by virtue of any rule of law, except in respect to any fraud or dishonesty of which the officer may be guilty. Section 2, Mr. Speaker, goes on to say, the Cayman Islands Red Cross may, in the Constitution or in any contract or agreement between it and its officers, employees, or volunteers, indemnify such officers, employees, and volunteers in respect to any loss arising or liability attaching to the officer, employee, or volunteer by virtue of any rule of law in relation to any of the affairs of the Cayman Islands Red Cross. And Section 3, Mr. Speaker, says the indemnification under Section 2 shall not extend to any matter in respect of any fraud or dishonesty of which the officer, employee, or volunteer may be guilty. The part about it, Mr. Speaker, I know the Honorable Attorney General spoke in his remarks about people helping people. But one of the things that kind of just jumped out at me was even traffic offenses, because to give someone such a broad indemnity, and if someone was to rear-end somebody, yes, trying to help, but rushing to help someone, and that person was to be injured during such a process, at a minimum, I believe that there should be some compensation or something due to if someone was affected in such a manner. So I do understand where the intent of the law is, but I think it's a little bit broad when you start considering maybe other traffic issues that may appear. And the other thing that jumped out at me, Mr. Speaker, was just in the Constitution of the Red Cross on page 14 and 15, where it touches, I think, yeah, the Constitution, in Section 4.7, to support and administer other charities within the territory, to establish 4.8, to establish other charities, but only with the prior written approval of the society, and 4.9, to raise funds by any legal means which are in conformity with the principal policies and regulations of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, including charging membership fees. I think it's, I just want to kind of fully understand the genesis behind that section in terms of establishing other charities, because then would those other charities receive this extension or these other indemnifications or whatever, or would it be expected to work? And finally, Mr. Speaker, section 4.17, where it says to ensure members of the committee against the costs of a successful defense to a criminal prosecution brought against them as trustees or against personal liability incurred in respect of any act or omission which is or is alleged to be a breach of trust or breach of duty, unless the member concerned knew that or was reckless whether the act or omission was a breach of trust or breach of duty. Again, Mr. Speaker, those are very broad to some extent, and when you say criminal prosecution, that is something that, as far as I know, can only be brought by the DPP. So again, from that standpoint, I'm trying to understand just how far the liability and the indemnification of the officers, members, and volunteers are going to go. Because at the same time, it's kind of a little bit broad and kind of carte blanche, and I just believe at a minimum that is something that needs to be addressed at least, so we fully understand what it is that we're voting on. Outside of that, Mr. Speaker, I support, again, what it is that the Red Cross is doing, but I just need to make sure that at a minimum that we don't pass any laws that would give anyone an indemnification against something that may happen to any citizen or person within the Cayman Islands. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, does the Honorable Attorney General wish to reply?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in respect of the concerns of the, if I might put it that high, I don't know the concerns, but the point raised by the Honorable Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, it is quite the contrary. As I mentioned, the legislation has been promoted by the British Red Cross Society itself, and it is part of their mandate, Mr. Speaker, that if we want to continue to use their emblems and the crescent, then they need to have some sort of, they need to be satisfied that there's some formal recognition within the territory by the territory's government and so. And that is part of the condition of the authorization for them to continue to use the crescent and the emblem. And so, Mr. Speaker, they were very supportive of this. They are the ones who actually craft the legislation and promoted it. I was speaking to senior legislative drafter who also was instrumental in the Anguilla legislation when that was dealt with there. So, Mr. Speaker, they are extremely supportive of it, and it's very good observation, but it is part of their expectation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to follow exactly the member from Montowns West position in Montowns West, in respect of his questions about the scope of the immunity. Is it? Yeah. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, my understanding of what is being proposed here, the primary purpose of what is being proposed here, first of all, is that the Red Cross as an organization in the Cayman Islands should bear responsibility for the acts and omissions, if you will, of the officers of the Red Cross, who are essentially volunteers, Mr. Speaker. So if, for example, I think to use this example, if in their rush to get somewhere, one of the drivers rear-ends someone's vehicle, and is damaged, and so in the course of their duty or in furtherance of their duty. The question is whether that particular volunteer should, or something should come of it, whether that particular person should pay out of his pocket, or whether the Red Cross as an entity would basically indemnify that person. So the tab would be picked up by not the volunteer worker, but by the Red Cross itself as an entity. And I suppose that is understandable why you would want to have that. But I think there was another issue here about dishonesty or fraud. I'm trying to find the section that you spoke to. 8.1, that's it. That's right. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Officers of the Cayman Islands Red Cross acting in relation to any of the affairs of the Cayman Islands Red Cross shall exempt from any liability attaching to them by virtue of any rule of law, except in respect of any fraud or dishonesty of which the officer may be guilty. The Cayman Islands Red Cross may, in its constitution or in any contract or agreement between it and the officer, employer, or volunteer, indemnify such officer. So 8.2 speaks to the indemnity that I'm speaking about, where the Red Cross would pick up the tab instead of the volunteer. And 3, the indemnification of subsection 3 shall not extend to any matter in respect of any fraud or dishonesty of which the officer, employee may be guilty. So, Mr. Speaker, 3 is really speaking to the fact that even though the Red Cross would indemnify the volunteer, if I might call him or her that, then where the volunteer is clearly guilty of dishonesty or fraud, then the Red Cross would not be, Red Cross as an organization would not be under any obligation to provide that level of indemnity. But I'm looking back at 8.1 because it is not clear to me what happened if there is negligence, I suspect, which is where you're heading. Right, that's all there. Could I just crave indulgence? Speaker, sorry. I was just having a chat there because I think we're moving away from exemption in cases where there's negligence. We just amended last year, or the year before, the Health Services Authority law to provide that persons can be sued for negligence. Of course, it wouldn't be just about any type of negligence, Mr. Speaker. The threshold or the bar would still be there, and so. So I suspect we might have to include a committee stage amendment to cover negligence in that case. I don't think the Red Cross people could have any quarrel about that, Mr. Speaker. And then there was 4.1. The crave indulgence, Mr. Speaker. You had another point about 4.1, please. Yes. 4.18.
4.17.
Yeah. OCs who shall have the following powers which may be exercised only further as a promotion officer to support and administer other charities within the territory, to establish other charities but only with prior written approval of the society, and to ensure members of the committee against cost of successful defense and criminal prosecution against them as a trustee. Mr. Speaker, may I just answer 4.17 first, because I don't think there is any issue with that. There, 4.17 is saying that the, read in context, it said the powers, the overseas branch shall have the following powers, which may be exercised only in furtherance of the promotion of the objects. And one of those powers that the overseas branch shall have is to ensure members of the committee, Mr. Speaker, against the costs of successful defense to a criminal prosecution brought against them as trustee or against personal liability. That has nothing to do with derogation of the powers of the DPP. This is simply saying that in the event that these persons are being prosecuted for fraud or dishonesty, the branch has the power, Mr. Speaker, to again indemnify them, provide them with insurance policy against any personal loss that they might incur in mounting their defense against any criminal prosecutions by the state. So that is, Mr. Speaker, is not a derogation from the powers of the DPP as it relates to criminal prosecutions, Mr. Speaker. In respect of 4.7 and 4.8, I understand this, Mr. Speaker, to say that the overseas branch, with obviously the approval of the British Red Cross Society, would have the remit, if you will, or the power to lend its support to and assistance in administering other charities within the territory. So I can think of, Mr. Speaker, other the Humane Society or other charities like that. There's nothing to prevent the Red Cross from partnering with them in administering those sort of things. Charity that deals with shelter for battered women or battered spouses, rather. There's nothing to prevent the Red Cross from partnering with them in dealing with those sort of initiatives and so. So that's how I read this, Mr. Speaker. I don't think there's an issue there. And of course, the question, subparagraph 8, is whether they themselves can establish other charities with the written approval of the British Red Cross Society. I don't think there's anything to prevent them from doing so if they think they have the capacity to establish subsidiary charities that is administered and are supported by the Red Cross. And so that's my understanding of it, Mr. Speaker. I hope I've been able to do some justice to the honourable member's concerns. If not, I'll be happy to discuss it further with him. Thank you.
The question is that a bill shortly entitled the Cayman Islands Red Cross Bill 2018 be given a second reading. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, the ayes have it. The Cayman Islands Red Cross Bill 2018 has been given a second reading.
The Penal Code Amendment Bill 2018.
The Honorable Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill, the long title of which is a bill for a law to amend the Penal Code 2018 revision to provide for the retrospective application of sexual harm prevention orders, to provide for the offenses in respect of sexual communication with a child, to provide for offenses in respect of sexual activities with a child, and for incidental and connected purposes.
The bill has been duly moved. Does the mover wish to speak thereto?
Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as stated in the title of the bill, Clause 2 is aimed at clarifying, Mr. Speaker, that sexual harm prevention order that was introduced via a 2017 amendment to the Penal Code can have a retroactive or retrospective application, Mr. Speaker, to cover instances where the sexual offense took place prior to the law coming into effect, but was only reported, detected, or prosecuted after the law came into effect. Mr. Speaker, I think we can all agree that it is not uncommon for some of these type of offenses to be committed over a prolonged period of time, and sometimes only come to light years after. So what this amendment is seeking to do, Mr. Speaker, is to make it clear that should that be the case and the person is prosecuted or is being prosecuted, the court can, in addition to the sentence, Mr. Speaker, impose a sexual harm prevention or interim prevention order as outlined in Section 45B of the Penal Code. And, Mr. Speaker, just to remind ourselves of what the Sexual Harm Prevention Order, or SHPO for short, SHPO order may be imposed by the court. Mr. Speaker, may be imposed by the court where, when dealing with an offense, Mr. Speaker, of a sexual or indecent nature, and the court is satisfied, on a balance of probabilities, Mr. Speaker, that it is necessary for the purpose of protecting the public or a particular member of the public from sexual harm from that particular person, or protecting the children or any vulnerable persons from that particular offender, Mr. Speaker. The court, on application of the DPP after consultation with the police, if the court is satisfied of the circumstances, the court may impose a sexual harm prevention order, Mr. Speaker, and that order may prohibit the offender from doing certain things, Mr. Speaker, from, for example, traveling to certain parts of the island, or traveling outside the island, or may prevent that person from accepting employment at a school, or accepting a job that involves care for children, and so on. Now, Mr. Speaker, that is a different thing from someone being prosecuted for an offense retrospectively. This is not what this is about. This is basically saying you have been prosecuted, you have been convicted, then in order to protect your victims, we can impose condition which says that you must not live at a particular place, you must not accept certain employment, or you must not deal with children or go near a playing field or something. So it's a sort of a restraint order, if you will, in terms of regulating the person's behavior. So the person is not being prosecuted retrospectively. It's just that their conduct is being regulated in terms of how they interact or interface with their victims or with particular member of the society, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in keeping with the government's overall commitment to protect the vulnerable in our society, and after further review, Mr. Speaker, of the current position, and, Mr. Speaker, the outcome of some recent court cases, the government decided that additional legislative measures should be put in place to, among other things, enable the courts to enjoy a much broader sentencing options in dealing with particular sex offenders and sexual predators, Mr. Speaker, especially those who prey upon children. Pardon me, sir. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, the bill also includes a number of other measures to create new offenses, specifically geared, Mr. Speaker, at adults who, for the purpose of obtaining sexual gratification, may be using social media to engage in inappropriate communication of a sexual nature with minors, Mr. Speaker, including trying to groom them, harass them, or otherwise abuse these minors. So, Mr. Speaker, the bill, in a general way, mirrors aspects of the 2003 UK Sexual Offences Act, especially, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to the prevalent use of social media to facilitate the commission of some of these offences. Mr. Speaker, by enacting these additional provisions in the Penal Code, the police and the prosecutors will be able to proffer charges that adequately capture the specific activities engaged in and thereby reflect the actual criminality, which, Mr. Speaker, will in turn invest the court with the ability to impose a sentence that is commensurate with the actual level of offending. Mr. Speaker, we recall some time ago there were one or two particular cases where persons were prosecuted, well, one in particular, where this was someone who was involved as a trainer, someone who was helping a child who was trying to develop or hone our sporting skills. And he was basically acting as a trainer, and he took advantage of the child using social media and then later on, other physical contact. But Mr. Speaker, because of the way the law is now, he could not be charged with these type of offenses. So he was charged under some offenses under the ICTA law, which carry a very limited sentence. I think the maximum there was 2 years. And so when the court sentenced him, of course the court's hands were tied in that respect, given the maximum sentence. And so he got what, in all honesty, was a lenient sentence. But because of the way he was charged, there wasn't really much the court could do in those circumstances. But the other point to make there is that charging him under that piece of legislation didn't actually capture the actual offending, the specific nature of the offending that he was involved with. But it was the most convenient way to prosecute him, given the absence of these type of offenses. And so, Mr. Speaker, that explains why he ended up with, we all agree, a very lenient sentence. I beg your pardon. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is meant to address that lacuna in the law. So if this bill is passed into law, it will be able to capture the actual activity, actual physical nature, the particular nature of the offending that that particular person was involved with. And so, Mr. Speaker, the bill will also take into account any aggravating features of such a behavior, including, as we have seen in the past, where the offender engages in a pattern of grooming, Mr. Speaker, of the minor, where the child is manipulated and exploited for sexual purposes by the provisions of gifts, by the provisions of clothing, by the provision of items of jewelry, and other allurement, Mr. Speaker. We have also, Mr. Speaker, heard about instances where the offender, being a person in a position of trust or otherwise able to exert undue influence, have engaged, Mr. Speaker, in a prolonged and significant history of communication with the minor through hundreds of explicit text messages, all, Mr. Speaker, of a sexual nature. So the bill, Mr. Speaker, therefore creates a number of new offenses covering conducts such as sexual communication, arranging to meet a child for sexual purposes following those communications, actually meeting the minor, Mr. Speaker, having communicated with the child, and sexually grooming that child, Mr. Speaker. And by grooming there we mean preparing the child over a period of time, using different sort of methods, allurement, etc. And actually then procuring a child for the purpose of sexual activity, Mr. Speaker. And covering instances such as the use of pornography as a grooming tool, Mr. Speaker, inviting the child to be engaged in these sort of things, watching pornography with a view to preparing the child mentally for getting involved in these sort of things. And Mr. Speaker, the bill also covers instances where a child would be invited to touch inappropriately, Mr. Speaker, certain parts of the adults, are engaged in other activities of a similar nature, Mr. Speaker, which are all sexual in nature. Mr. Speaker, as mentioned before, where the circumstances is of an aggravating, or the circumstance is of an aggravating nature, but because the person is in a position of trust that causes the child to engage in any of these activities, then, Mr. Speaker, special consideration applies. Now, let me say that again. So, Mr. Speaker, where the person is in a position of trust and they carry out any of these activities of a sexual nature with a child, then that would be deemed, Mr. Speaker, an aggravating feature of such an offense. And in such circumstances, Mr. Speaker, the punishment will carry an element of mandatory minimum term of imprisonment ranging between 4 to 6 years, depending on if there is a plea of guilty, and, Mr. Speaker, if there are some exceptional circumstances which might help to mitigate, or for that matter, aggravate the offense. Mr. Speaker, in other areas in the bill, the sentences range from between 4 to 12 years. And, Mr. Speaker, the bill also, for the benefit of this House, lists examples of who would be considered persons in a position of trust. Mr. Speaker, in addition to what I've just outlined about the sentences, in addition to ensure some consistency in the type or the range of sentences that has been to be imposed for these offenses, the Honorable Chief Justice has confirmed that the judiciary, through the Criminal Justice Reform Committee, is working on sentencing guidelines, Mr. Speaker, for these sexual and other sexual offenses, so to ensure some consistency across the board in terms of the sentences imposed. Mr. Speaker, I know some members have some concerns about the range of sentences, and we will certainly listen and see how best we can take those on board. Mr. Speaker, the bill also seeks in Clause 4 to amend Section 135 of the Penal Code to modernize the provisions dealing with the defilement of persons who we term idiots and imbeciles, Mr. Speaker. The bill seeks to employ a less pejorative description of such victims, and instead, Mr. Speaker, casting the language in a way that make it clear that it is meant to cover and to protect some of our most vulnerable in our society, namely, Mr. Speaker, persons who are mentally impaired to the extent that the disability will impede their ability to properly consent to any sexual activity. So, Mr. Speaker, no longer would we seek to refer to them as idiots and imbecile, but merely persons who are mentally impaired. Mr. Speaker, finally, the bill seeks to create a new offense which is called assault by penetration, and that is in Clause 3 of the of the bill, Mr. Speaker, is going to be a new Section 132A. Mr. Speaker, the basis for that is that currently under the Penal Code, the non-rape offenses are contained within the offenses classified as indecent assault or gross indecency. So there's no separation, Mr. Speaker, of the more serious offenses from the lesser actions of the offenders. Example, Mr. Speaker, the touching of a breast and the digital penetration of a child would both be charged as either indecent assault or gross indecency. And so, Mr. Speaker, the bill now seeks to create a separate provision to reflect the significantly more aggravated offense of a penetration of the victim by the child or otherwise, whether vaginally or through the anus, or through the mouth for that matter, with any part of the body, or with an object, Mr. Speaker. Of course, must be done with a sexual intent in mind. And that would more adequately reflect the actual offending behavior of that offender. So, Mr. Speaker, although there's a slight bit of overlap with the offense of rape, this particular new offense is a much wider offense, and as you would see, it carries a sentence of up to 10 years, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I endeavor to outline what we're attempting to do here. It is true, Mr. Speaker, that it is probably a poignant reminder that we live in a society where there is a lot of moral equivocation, if I might put it that way. And some of what we're seeing playing out in front of our eyes, and the behavior of some of our older folks in our society has driven us to this stage where we need to put in place legislation that will protect the most vulnerable within our society, Mr. Speaker. So I commend the bill to honorable members and certainly would also welcome their perspective. Thank you.
Now you know if the
Is the member from Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, I'd like to commend Attorney General and the legal department for taking a shot at this grave concern that I think all of us that live in the Cayman Islands and throughout the world at this time are having to deal with. I thank you, sir, but I'm disappointed, totally disappointed, when I see the slap on the wrist penalties that are being offered to the ruination, the destruction of young children. You have the title as the Penal Code Amendment Bill 2018. I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that it should be entitled Protection of Children from Sexual Predators. Earlier this year, my colleague from Bordentown West and I tabled a motion asking for the government to look at this grave situation. Mr. Speaker, are we serious about stemming the tidal wave of child sexual abuse in these islands and stop the slap on the wrist approach? glad to see the 8 amendments read in Clause 5. And for the benefit of the public, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to read them briefly so we can see what we're dealing with. This is not Sunday school stuff, colleagues. Any of you that have children or grandchildren, please wake up. We are spending this week here in celebration of 60 years of our national coat of arms. Let us celebrate at this time in this beautiful island the preservation of our children. Clause 5, Section 1, which is being inserted, sexual communications with a child, where a person communicates with a child with the intention that such communication encourages the child to make a communication that is sexual or related to a sexual activity. 2, arranging to meet a child following sexual communication, where a person has communicated with the child on one or more occasions and subsequently arranges to meet that child for the purpose of the commission of an activity that is sexual in nature. 3, meeting a child following sexual communication, where a person has communicated with the child on one or more occasions and subsequently meets that child for the purpose of the commission of an activity that is sexual in nature. Procuration of a child for a sexual activity, which is 4, where a person engages in conduct with intent to procure a child for the purpose of the commission of an activity that is sexual in nature. 5, causing a child to watch a sexual activity where a person intentionally causes a child to watch another person engaging in an activity that is sexual in nature. 6, engaging in sexual activity in the presence of a child. I don't know what aggravating circumstances could that a lawyer or someone could take to a court to justify something like this. It's beyond my comprehension. Where a person intentionally engages in an activity that is sexual in nature in the presence of a child. Inviting a child to participate in sexual activity where a person invites a child to engage in touching or other behavior that is sexual in nature. I like this one. Abuse of position of trust. Where a person being in a position of trust engages in any communication or activity that is sexual in nature with a child. The section defines a position of trust as including any position which involves the regular caring for training, supervising, or being in charge of that child. The last paragraph, it indicates possible sentences. I suggest at this stage, Mr. Attorney General, and the sentences in this specific area, the sentences of respect to these new offenses range from 4 to 12 years. Are you kidding? I would suggest, sir, 6 to 15 years with the offense of abuse of possible trust of carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 4 years. I say minimum 6. And where the offender pleads guilty for doing this, for whatever extenuating and aggravating or whatever the fancy words they use in the court system, 10 years, Mr. Speaker. You had young children, you got grandchildren. Must be a minimum of 10 years. I say this, Mr. Speaker, if you're caught with a firearm, and I was pleased that I had the opportunity in cabinet and otherwise put a minimum of 10 years. How can you compare this to a ruined child life? No, it's wrong. It must be looked at, colleagues. It must be looked at. I know and understand, and I agree that judges must have some situations and extenuating circumstances, but you're not going to bring this to me, an adult molesting and having sexual activity with a child under 16. No, you will never live as long as to convince me of that. So let's stop pussyfooting around with this thing and do the right thing for our children. Every one of you there at some stage or other, a child, and now in my instance, grandchildren. No way in hell. I saw, quite interesting, Mr. AG in 132A. Subject to subsection 2, a person who, for the purpose of obtaining sexual gratification, intentionally and without consent, penetrates, whether orally, vaginally, or anally, another person. B, in this instance, it doesn't say, I wonder why they didn't say a child in this one, Mr. AG. Is this indicating an older person? Which brings me to what we talked about across the floor yesterday, with an object or part or a body or commits an offense on summary conviction or conviction indictment to imprisonment for 10 years. How are we, as a legislative body, when the promised legislation from yesterday that says that the LGBT people under that situation have their human rights?
Premier, we have passed the honourable member, if you could take your seat. We passed the hour of 4:30.
Mr. Speaker, I move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2 in order that the business of the House may continue beyond the hour of interruption.
The question is that the House suspend Standing Orders 10-2 to allow us past the hour of 4:30. All in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The honourable member may continue his speech.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And back to the people of interest that take care of the children. I'm sure we're all aware that even some of the clergy, Mr. Speaker, and this is sad, in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I'm sure many of you have heard of that situation where the Catholic priests molested, I think it was over 1,000 or 1,500 children. Are we grasping the magnitude of what's happening, not only in Cayman, but throughout the world? We're not dealing with our responsibility as a legislative assembly, Mr. Speaker, is to do our best to protect the children of these islands. Not being negative or critical, I had to ask myself, does the drafters of some of this legislation and the adjudicators have young children or grandchildren? Because this thing just tears my heart out like nothing that I ever know when I see and read about this kind of stuff. Something is terribly wrong if we can't have the backbone to protect our children. these sexual predators must be dealt with and dealt with force. These are not Sunday school teachers, colleagues. They plan these things, they set them up. We need to get them from around our children for a long, long time. As I said before, young lives are ruined, and you can check the psychiatric and whatever stages that their children go through when a traumatic situation like this happens. Most of the time for life. And then we can come and say, give them 4 to 6 years. No, man, no way. We got to get serious. What kind of deterrent is this? What kind of deterrent? And then you can turn around when they get into what one was there for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And they get credit for time. So help, my goodness, it should be like how it is in the States with some of these. And far as I know, Mr. Attorney General, at one stage, rape, which was going for adults, can be given a life sentence. Well, it's not whatever appears. And you could tell me you could come here now bringing something 4 to 6 years after destroying a young child? No way in hell. Excuse my French, Mr.
That's what it is.
I have 3 young family members. And God forbid, if someone is stupid enough to violate one of them, may the powers that be have mercy on their soul. Come on, colleagues. Come on, listen. Listen to this, and please encourage our Honorable Attorney General, and he knows how I feel about these things when he and I sat in cabinet. We got to stop the nonsense. Let us stop pussyfooting with it when it comes to helping and protecting our vulnerable children. Let us put real teeth in our legislation that will act as a real deterrent to those would-be sexual predators. I implore my good friend, the Minister of Education, who shares many of my views with these situations and so on and so forth. And the battle is just beginning, Mr. Chairman. As I gathered from yesterday, but I got a father up there that neither sleeps nor slumber. We'll be onto these islands. In closing, Mr. Speaker and colleagues, I ask you, is 4 years the value of a destroyed child? I ask you, is 6 years the value of a destroyed child? Is 8, 10, or 12 years the value of our abused children? I urge the government, through the Honorable Attorney General, to please take another look and bring the necessary amendments that will do this Legislative Assembly proud. And in years to come, they will look up to what we did here in Cayman Brac. And Mr. Speaker, thank you much for your time.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member from East End.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am not going against my friend, the elected member from Savannah. If he say 15 years, that's what we're calling for. However, I need to add a little more to support him. He is our moral compass out here, and we are stuck in the direction he's going in. If that's in a storm, then we are going to go in that storm together, back to back. Mr. Speaker, I believe I said to one of my colleagues on the other side yesterday, we've been here, what, 3 days now? Might have been Wednesday. Mr. Speaker, I believe I said to one of my colleagues over there that we are allowing people to change the narrative of this country. And we need to stop it. The people in this country, Mr. Speaker, whom we are all responsible to, have been crying for stiffer penalties when it comes to the abuse of our children. They have been crying, they have been angry about it, and they have taken their frustrations out on the judges. Listen to them on the radios. They say the judges are not Caymanians, they are not Caymanian, they do not understand us as a people. They say this about the judge, they say that about the judge. Judges, I am here to tell them that their frustrations are directed incorrectly. Their frustrations must be directed on us. We are responsible for their well-being. No judges, no judge ever will be responsible for the well-being of the people of this country. They merely carry out the wishes of this legislature. We make the laws to govern our people. We make the laws whether they're right, wrong, or indifferent. Too many times we cut or copy and paste, and it needs to stop. Laws in this country must be beneficial to our people, the Caymanian people, and those who call these islands their home. Mr. Speaker, my good friend from Savannah said that he understands the judges with their concerns about mitigation. Mr. Speaker, there is nothing wrong with that. They are concerned about mitigation. Well, the same way we put it 4 to 12, we can put it 10 to 20. And they can't go any lower than 10. It is not for them to say what must be paid back to society, how society sees these crimes. That's our job on behalf of the people who sent us here. Therefore, we must do it in accordance with the wishes of the people. For too long, they have abused our children in this country. I don't care who they are. Get that straight. If it is my brother, let him look at striped stars for the time allotted to him. It matters not to me. But we have a moral duty, a constitutional responsibility to deal with this thing how we feel like. Forget about the Attorney General. He's but a lawyer. We are not lawyers. We were elected because the people thought we were the best to protect them and their rights. And their children in this instance. And we are going to walk out here this evening, about 4 years. He proposes whatever he thinks the rules of the court is going to be amenable to, and the likes and what have you. We make the laws. We don't have to acquiesce to what he says. We can change it. My good friend said that, from Savannah, said that these are not Sunday school teachers. I like to say, these are not people peddling Bibles out of the back of their cars, you know. These people do not mean our young children any good. The Minister of Education, she get up here this week with 900 pages of what she could do for our children and what she's asking us to assist her to do with our children. For what? For naught, if we don't protect them elsewhere. From these people, whether they are neighbors or enemies or foes, our family, it matters not. The message must be sent that it will not be tolerated in this country, and you are going to go to prison. You know what we are encouraging? We are encouraging people to take the law in their own hands by putting these little small sentences on people. That's what we're going to encourage. And we need to stop it. God, tell me, Mr. Speaker, recently we had a particular case, and I don't know the case, but it was reported some stepfather got 6 months or something of that nature. Stepfather jailed for indecent assault on child. 6 months in prison. 6 months in prison? Are we going to allow the judges to say that the mitigating circumstances was such that they only require 6 months? 6 months? You haven't had a good square meal in 6 months in prison by the time you come out. And then the child has to live in that environment? Are we kidding? I know of one where he was released. He said the devil had made him done it. And he was released with the condition that the child didn't stay in the yard again. 10-year-old? This is what we got to do? Colleagues, this is a plea to you. I hope I don't think I'm hollering at you, but this is a plea to all of us. Let us change the narrative. This is ours. And you remember the teacher for indecent assault?
9 months.
9 months. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Attorney General for bringing the bill with all the different areas that we can catch people on. He spoke of the coach that we didn't have any provision to get him on. We had to do it under the ICTA law. I applaud you, but I want to know if you can't count over 10. At your age and you don't know more than 10? Or 12? What is a dozen and half dozen is what you know? Mr. Speaker, I don't mean be disrespectful to the Attorney General. I am just passionate about this, as we all are in support of our colleague on this side. It is wrong. Anyone you see do that is of no use to society. If it were left to me, it would be life imprisonment, a punishment of life by other means, whatever. This is wrong. We cannot allow people. I can understand somebody smoking a little ganja and they know they only got to get 3 months or something like that. There's no hurt to anyone else. You're taking away a life, an entire life you have destroyed. And we give them 6 months and tell them come back now society. And to find a society that can be done in, not in this one. We have sent people to prison more time, for more time, for less. And we are just following. I know they had a motion on the floor, Mr. Speaker, my good friend from Savannah, Bordentown West. And I know, I heard the rumblings, because the motion said minimum of 10 years, I think. And I heard the rumblings that the judges are not going to accept it. Who are the judges? They do as we say.
Mr. Speaker, really, is this appropriate? It's actually hurting the ears of people at home who are messaging me. Raise the quality of your argument, not your voice. We can all hear perfectly well.
Mr. Speaker, he looking at abandoned.
It really is offensive. It really is offensive.
Yesterday when he was yelling in here, it wasn't offensive though. It wasn't offensive though. But it appears like nobody listens. And if he finds it offensive, it is offensive to me, my colleagues, and all the people in this country. Maybe they don't find it offensive over there, but let's see what they do. Or maybe he can get up and tell the people whether he finds it offensive or not. It's very offensive to the people of this country. And it's time we corrected it. And the judges can only administer what we give them. And they can say that it's incompatible with human rights, and we can send it back the same way. Mr. Speaker, for too long, the people of this country has been crying for something, for justice, for sentences that reflect the crime. And we sit down here, and yes, the government must be applauded for bringing it. The government must be applauded for bringing it. But it cannot be that the government is prepared to sit down here and approve 4 years for molesting our children. Well, Cabinet it can't come here unless Cabinet approves it. Molesting our children, and then given higher sentences, and then make a caveat that in case where the individual pleads guilty, impose a sentence of imprisonment for a time of not less for at least 4 years. You pleaded guilty, and I must give you breaks on it. You have pled guilty. In any other case, impose a sentence of imprisonment for a term of at least 6 years. So that is if he's found guilty then. Really? 2 years? Four and 6? Put the minimum higher and the maximum higher. And they have to work within there. Mr. Speaker, this is about the person being found guilty or having pled guilty. There is no question the person is guilty through whatever means. Mr. Speaker, I am going to rest my case, and I want to see the government at the very least change this to increase that minimum. They're saying you can't put minimum sentences, but they're putting minimum sentences here by saying 4 or 6. And we're saying no. The country is saying no. Make the minimum 10. Even 8. My good friend said 6. But even 8. It can't be in mitigating circumstances if you're guilty of molesting a child, found guilty by the court, and you still, the sentence is afterwards, after you found guilty. And there are some circumstances in there that you must get some degree of leniency. Come on. You come in there and you plead guilty to it. You plead guilty, oh, I didn't know that was the age of the child. Well, then it's your responsibility to find out. It's not the responsibility of the child. Well, she looked more than 16. Those are the mitigating circumstances. Cannot be the mitigating circumstances that attracts any leniency. At least not from me. Mr. Speaker, I believe that we must listen more closely to the people who elect us. We must listen more closely to the people who elect us and hear what they're telling us. Listen to it, hear it, and act accordingly. I know many of us in this country, Mr. Speaker, are sympathetic to murder until it drops on our doorstep. Many of us. But in the case of children, people are not sympathetic to it. When they see the reports, they get up in arms. And we can hear it. We see it. They get on the radio shows. They get on the blogs.
Honorable Member, you have made your point, and it's well taken. the issue is something we are all against, of course we are, but it don't take away from the fact that you are repeating yourself and you have made your point over and over and over, and it's a good point, but it has to cut off at some point.
Mr. Speaker, it's time to go home, huh? It's time to go home, I think. Yeah. So we can all take a break. Cayman Brac not been good to my nose, huh? Mr. Speaker, I will. I hear you. You know, I hear you. Mr. Speaker, I want to see them do something about this. It's time now. And since you say you elected to, and you say other things from the podium, as a speaker, then I want to hear you make your plea to them, the government too, to do something about
What
this.
is the member inviting me to do? Honorable Minister, I don't expect you to answer that.
You don't?
I think you finish your speech, and I'll call on the next member. Another the member from Prospect.
Mr. Speaker, just a moment, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Member from Prospect.
I would like to add some small contribution to the present debate that is on the floor of this Honorable House at the moment. I am counselor for the Ministry of Community Affairs, which has responsibility for gender affairs, and that includes children in many respects. So the proposed bill has some relevance to me, not only in an official capacity, but certainly, as the members have pointed out rather extensively, as a father, I am very concerned about the current status quo and what level of protection the state affords our children. I would like to thank the honorable members for their impassioned remarks. However, I would like to also acknowledge that this subject of crimes against children is a very emotive conversation. We are all parents in this room. We have children or grandchildren, or we are aunts and uncles. But as the member, honorable member from East End pointed out, we are not all lawyers. And I think that, Mr. Speaker, is a poignant remark when we try to understand what this bill is seeking to propose. We are not, Mr. Speaker, as egregious as the acts described in the bill may seem. And I point to them in Clause 5. Sexual communication with a child, where a person communicates with a child with the intention that such communication encourages that child to make a communication that is sexual or related to a sexual activity. 2, arranging to meet a child following sexual communication. Meeting a child following sexual communication. Causing a child to watch a sexual activity, presumably by communicating to that child that sexual activity. The point here is, as egregious and as disgusting and as infuriating as these acts may seem to us personally, this bill is not speaking to the penalties applied to the physical act of carrying out these offenses, but is instead talking about addressing the gaps that exist in legislation right now in communicating these acts. Or as the law or the word defines grooming, it is preparing a child over time. We are not talking about the physical act of assaulting a child in this legislation. It is seeking simply, and the Honorable Attorney General gave reference to 2 court cases that recently passed through the court system, and it found that the court's hands were tied because the only maximum penalty that could be derived were found in the ICTA laws, ways of communicating over an electronic network or otherwise. This penal code, this amendment bill, is seeking, in the first instance, honorable members, to address the gaps that presently do not exist in the law with the stated purpose of protecting our children. However, because this proposal is talking about the communication that is attached to following through on that physical act, that I believe members may be a little confused. We talk about slap on the wrist penalties. Mr. Speaker, I have to say that similar legislation that deals with the communication of a sexual act, not, again, performing the sexual act, but communicating that sexual act, carries lesser penalties than is being proposed here. In the United Kingdom, under similar laws, their penalties range for these offenses 12 months to 2 years. We are proposing 4 years to 12 years. On the 10-year sentence aspect of the bill, it is seeking a maximum of 10 years, but a minimum of 4. But clearly, when we compare the penalties, we are taking it 2, 3, 4 notches above what a larger jurisdiction, the United Kingdom, have applied to the same offense. We also have to understand that whilst this bill will seek to address gaps in current legislation that do not exist, so that the incidents related to the coach or otherwise, who we are all familiar with, could have, if these amendments were included as part of the penal code, perhaps the sentences would have been more to the liking, certainly the general acceptance of everyone. But they did not exist. And therefore, the proposals herein outlined, Mr. Speaker, are seeking to complement, to bolster the level of protection the state provides in protecting its children from sexual predators, both in the act of communicating that indecent assault and in the act of actually carrying it out. I hear the members talking about the penalties that they believe should be appropriate for indecent assault and rape. And I just simply want to point out to the members that the penal code carries penalties for the physical act of these egregious offenses against children. Section 132 of the Penal Code deals with indecent assault, and it carries a maximum penalty of 10 years. Section 127 of the Penal Code deals with the physical act of rape, and it carries a maximum penalty of imprisonment for life. So the Penal Code agrees with you, as me, that these offenses deserve very serious penalties attached thereto. But as emotive as this conversation is, Mr. Speaker, I simply want to remind the members that this bill does not propose to address the physicalities of these offenses, but the mere communication. It is talking about communicating these offenses. And let me give you another example. Whilst it is seeking to protect, at its intent, the sexual predator from the child, this law, this bill, if made law, Mr. Speaker, would also apply to the 18-year-old boy who may be WhatsApping a 16-year-old girl. She perhaps on the verge of turning 17, adolescent young love. We could potentially be wrapping up young people committing nothing more than flirtations and committing them to prison for life. We have to be careful what we're seeking to accomplish and also what this bill is trying to communicate. And I simply point out that this bill is seeking to address the method of communication and therefore the offenses related to it, rather than the physical act of, again, and I accept and acknowledge, these acts are egregious, and every member in this House agrees with you. But let's try to understand what the bill proposes and leave the emotion out of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I had hoped that we would have completed the business on the order paper today, but it is clear that that is not going to happen unless we run the House into the kind of hours we did this morning. I spent my entire birthday here, finished at 12:30. It is Friday evening, 5:15 in Cayman Brac. There is a reception planned of which I am the host. I am not, Mr. Speaker, proposing to delay or cancel that. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I am going to move the adjournment of this honorable House until 10 a.m. on Wednesday, the 12th of September. We will resume, Mr. Speaker, at the Legislative Assembly in Georgetown, Grand Cayman.
Question is that this honorable House do adjourn until Wednesday, 12th of September, 10 a.m. All in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. The honorable House stands adjourned until Wednesday, the 12th of September, 10 a.m.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my alacrity to adjourn the House, I omitted to thank the good people of Cayman Brac, and particularly those who have made the arrangements and made our stay here so comfortable and so useful. Mr. Speaker, I think the decision to come here on the 50th anniversary of the first of these meetings in Cayman Brac, and also to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Celebrate Cayman, the conferral of the coat of arms, was the right decision. I know that the good people of Cayman Brac have truly appreciated the visit, and I hope that most members of the House, if not all, would have had the opportunity to get a better understanding and feel for the issues and concerns of the people of Cayman Brac, and an opportunity to tour the island and see the great progress that has been made in terms of infrastructure development, but also to note areas where there is additional need, and that all members are now that much better informed and apprised, so that when the government comes with proposals for projects, programs, and assistance for the sister islands, they will be that much better placed to support those measures. And so again, Mr. Speaker, thanks very much to all of the people of Cayman Brac. I am especially grateful to the Deputy Premier and the Minister for Education for assisting and facilitating this visit, and the hard work of yourself and the clerk and the other members of the Legislative Assembly of the office in making sure that we had everything that we needed. Again, Mr. Speaker, I thank you, and I can't say as someone else said, I shall return, for I know not that, but I have certainly enjoyed this meeting here in Cayman Brac. It is the third such since I have been elected.
Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the opposition, we too would like to thank the people of Cayman Brac for being such generous hosts. We have thoroughly enjoyed the visit, and also to thank the staff who we know were working under some adjustable circumstances, but it was a good meeting. We enjoyed our stay here in the Brac, and we look forward to a soon return. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The House is adjourned. On my part, I want to thank everyone that participated in this past week of activities. I will not repeat what others have said, but merely to thank people like Mr. Randall and others who have been here on broadcasting, and Mr. Wilkes. And of course, thanks have all been extended to the staff. I want to thank my own assistants for their work, but more so to, and I trust that this is still on record, that to thank Ventisha, and I can only call first names at this point, Rhonda Webster, Pat Hewlett, and Kim Bullings, and Christy Watler, and Jana Bush, and there was another girl, I think the young lady from up here that works, I think, with tourism. I can't remember her name. Shavella Tatum. To thank all of them, because they really worked hard for a successful evening with the young people, and those of us that took the time to come out and be with those young people. That hall was packed, and others, and in fact to thank the families of the persons that served, that made an effort to come to Cayman Brac to celebrate with us the 50 years, 1968-2018. And I want to thank all of you members, and thank the government for helping to organize, and certainly to stand the cost. Thanks to all of them.